Norman had always held his small routines like an oath. By 9 each morning he had performed the same minor liturgies: switch on the desk lamp even though the department kept fluorescent time with the rest of the building. Peel 2 Starkless biscuits from the emergency tin Clara kept for colleagues in distress. Make a neat stack of 3 sticky notes, one for today, one for this week, and one for the improbable category he labeled if all else fails. These actions were not merely comforts. In a place that scheduled the end of things with the same unflinching arithmetic as a tax return, the little repeated movements were a way of saying to the universe, in a very specific font, "I am still here." That afternoon, the department's usual ambient noises, the whir of machines, the distant ceremonial clearing of throats when memos were redacted, the tepid gurgle of the communal kettle seemed slightly out of rhythm. Not because of any catastrophic metric, or because Auditor Primus had issued a new edict, but because the world outside had developed a new, polite hiccup. Not the kind that comes from indigestion or from an impolite emperor, but a geological, cosmological hiccup. Fountains stuttered mid-arc. Streetlights blinked twice like embarrassed eyelashes, and a pigeon doing the morning rounds over the 7th atrium folded its wings in an exacting, bureaucratic salute. Norman noticed these things because he was a small man trained to notice. He had been taught by a town that prized punctuality. Clocks were folks you consulted rather than servants you commanded. But on this day there was another reason his attention held. He had biscuits in his pocket intended to be shared. The risk of sharing was not merely the risk of crumbs. It was the risk of revealing that he enjoyed the scent of someone else's hair, that he listened like a person marked by real longing, that perhaps he might be willing to set aside a procedure if the cost was, for once, humane. Clara sat 3 desks down from him, as she always did, with a pencil tucked behind her ear and a radio tuned to nothing anyone in authority could identify. Her desk was a small archive of human necessities, a calendar printed with a kitten in a blazer, a roll of duct tape labeled "just in case," and her emergency biscuit tin which rattled when she laughed. She had become, over time, the person to whom Norman gave the marginalia that no one else read. She annotated his small miseries with advice you could fold into a pocket and carry through the day. Buy fresh ink, call your sister, stop proofreading other people's griefs. On ordinary days, Norman would not have dared to leave his desk for any reason that was not pre-approved by at least 2 policy memos and 1 footnote in the charter. On extraordinary days, the ones that made the neon strip light above his head feel as if it had a heart, he allowed himself one small revolt. That afternoon he stood, tucked the biscuit tin under his arm, and walked to Clara, who was looking at a scheduling error on her screen with the serene expression of someone who had once been adopted by a ledger and loved it. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, and discovered his voice could be uneven in ways his forms never were. It betrayed him with commas and ellipses. Clara looked up, and for a moment her face composed itself in the precise way that signatures do when trying to be legible. "Norman, you owe me a biscuit for when the world tries to use polite punctuation on us," he offered. She accepted. They sat near the break room window and watched the department thrash about being competent in its particular fashion. A photocopier coughed out a pamphlet titled "When to Use a Sigh in Policy Statements." Someone in the next cubicle stapled their tie to a requisition form and had no idea. Silence between them was not empty. Norman liked to put things in silence, the way some people put things in drawers. He put his hands on his lap and fiddled with the tiny stapler he carried like a talisman. Clara opened the biscuit tin and offered him the last lemon biscuit. "You look tired," Clara said. Her voice was a thing of functional tenderness. She administered it like a bandage. "I am tired," Norman admitted, "of being the sort of person who always seeks the form when perhaps he should be seeking the thing the form is supposed to protect." Clara's eyes softened in a way that made Norman imagine she had a small, private catalogue of soft things and that he had been permitted to leaf through it. Then stop seeking the form for a minute and tell me something non-procedural. He thought of the poem folded in his breast pocket, one of the tiny rebellions had kept since he was young, verses he read when the edges of his life felt too sharp. Poetry in the department was an act of illicit kindness, like leaving a chair for someone who had been waiting too long. Norman unfolded the paper with deliberate slowness. "It's nothing special," he said, which was a reliable falsehood because things he cherished were rarely special in the way the department defined the term. "I keep it in case I ever need to remind myself that small things matter." Clara rolled her shoulders the way an adjudicator might clear the docket. "Then read it to me. If it's good, it'll help you file it under persisting delights. If it's terrible, you can file it under private embarrassments and never speak of it again." There was a small, conspiratorial laugh in her voice. Norman found himself obeying. He read the poem as if it were a fragile ledger, as if every comma held a ledger account of meaning. The words escaped him and were not exactly his. They had belonged to a night 10 years removed, when failure had stacked like unpaid invoices and he had needed a voice to speak back. He read, "There is a room where the clocks doze, where the cups collect the shape of steam. A man folds his hands as if in prayer, though he cannot remember what for. They call him clerk, he calls himself the bridge. He takes what is torn and marks it whole. This is not a divine job, nor heroic it is the keeping of small things, so they do not fall." He stumbled at the third line and recovered. The words were clumsy when they belonged to his mouth. Clara listened with that precise attention she gave to forms when she was auditing them for human errors. The biscuit tin between them made a polite, ceremonial clink. When he finished, Clara exhaled like a stamp, leaving an impression. "That's lovely," she said simply, and the simplicity made the words heavy with approval. "It's not supposed to be lovely," Norman protested, embarrassed by the sudden heating of his cheeks. "It's supposed to be honest." "Honesty is a rare office supply," Clara observed. "We should ration it more carefully." It was then that Enoch passed by with his mop, whistling a tune that had once been older than rain. He paused, tilted his head, and looked at them like someone who had been present for many beginnings. "Poetry is not a misuse of time," he said. "It is an emergency procedure for the heart. Keep a copy near the kettle." The janitor's approval had the effect of an authorized stamp. Norman felt the world lighten a fraction. Perhaps it was simply the removal of another small restraint, but moments are arithmetic too. They left the building for a walk because the department, for all its rituals, did not own outdoor air and because humidity itself held the right rhetorical pause. The plaza outside the atrium boasted a fountain whose jet had developed a minor, persistent stutter. Children had stopped by earlier in the day to time its hiccups. Today it was performing its half-second delay with the dignified rhythm of a metronome, uncertain whether it wanted to be a clock or a fountain. The stone was pleasantly warm from a sun that had learned to keep its timing slightly loose lately. Norman and Clara walked side by side along the balustrade, a careful distance measured more by paperwork than desire, or perhaps by both. People in the plaza paused to watch the fountain's uneven spray, and in that ordinary attention there was an extraordinary concurrency. Everyone noticed the same small surprise at once, like a city taking a communal breath. It temporarily made the ordinary feel heroic. Norman's poem had given him permission to do something he rarely allowed himself to do, speak about what he feared. "I thought," he said, watching water hesitate and then leap as if embarrassed, "that if the world had to end, it would be better to end with things resolved. But in beginning to think it's the unresolved things that matter the most. Even a badly tied shoelace can keep you walking." Clara laughed, and it was the sort of sound that mapped itself to the back of his throat in a pleasing way. "That's the most bureaucratic, romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." He shrugged, trying to be casual, and failed. "It doesn't feel romantic when you say it like that." It feels like someone trying to file a life without the right form, she suggested. Exactly. Like someone trying to produce a signature in the margins. There was a pause during which the fountain hiccuped in what could almost have been sympathy. Norman turned to Clara with a steadiness he had not expected. Do you ever think about what it would mean to not follow procedure for once? To choose the messy thing instead of the tidy one? Clara considered him with the careful curiosity she reserved for policy anomalies that promised to be interesting. I think about it a lot. I also think about staplers that work when you need them to. Both are useful. Their laughter ran together and lightened everything like a diffuser taking the edge off. Then, on an impulse as small and consequential as a page turned during an audit, Norman reached for Clara's hand. She did not pull away. Her fingers were warm and slightly crumbed with lemon sugar. They sat on the fountain's edge. He read another stanza from the folded paper, but the words had become superfluous because language between them had shifted to the kind that does not require punctuation. They shared stories about small wounds that had never healed properly, and about the funny things their parents had done with their time. Norman told her about his exam that had not gone well, the one that rerouted him into the sacred geography of clerical work. Clara told him about the file of an old woman who stamped her own mail with hearts. The afternoon thickened like the stockock of a well-made stew. The department felt, for the first time in weeks, like a place that could be invaded by sunlight and survive. Norman felt certain of two things at once: that he loved the small, human present he shared with Clara, and that the clock on the desk in his cubicle had been counting down in invisible numerals. Love and forms existed in an uneasy parity. He had learned to hold both without letting one erase the other. Then he kissed her. It was a modest thing, an almost apologetic press of mouth to mouth that asked for permission and offered it in equal measure. It was fumbling and earnest, and perfectly inadequate to express the sudden surplus of feelings. Clara's eyes widened, then closed reluctantly, like a committee yielding a point. The world around them, including the fountain and three pedestrians, seemed to lean in a fraction of an inch. They had only the briefest of interludes before a memo slid under the department door like a flat, officious animal. Its arrival registered with the same gravity as a bell at a tribunal. Someone at the department had deduced that 2 employees were using paid time for non-procedural welfare. By the time Norman disentangled himself from the moment and looked up, the plaza had completed an orderly arc of events that could be described in meeting minutes: laughter, a polite cough, and then the faintest of continental hiccups that rolled across the city like a polite gust of wind. The hiccup sounded for a heartbeat, like applause. Norman and Clara stared at one another, then at the fountain, then at the sky, as if they expected an usher to appear and inventory their feelings. The absurdity of it made them both laugh so hard they nearly fell off the balustrade. That's probably a sign of tectonic embarrassment. Enoch observed as he passed, pausing to look at the memo evidently meant to dispatch distractions. Or else the universe has decided to be amused. Keep your heads down. Keep your hearts public. They walked back, hand in hand for reasons less structural than urgent, and each step felt like a small contraband. At the department door, Aria Vost waited with her red pen held like a scepter and a face that was perfectly calibrated for both reprimand and unexpected mercy. 2 minutes, she said without preamble. You are on probation for emotional misfiling. But her voice cracked the way the departments plaster cracks when there's a heat wave. Do not let this make you reckless. We still have forms to file. Norman nodded. He wanted to promise that he wouldn't be reckless, and at the same time, he wanted to promise that he might risk a procedural infraction if it meant preserving something as small and brilliant as the afternoon had just nearly ruined. He felt a new sort of courage settling in his ribs, less tidy than the courage of ticking boxes, but a courage that smelled like lemon, biscuits, and old paper. They returned to their desks. Work resumed with an odd, elastic quality, the kettle sang with slightly more passion. Gideon muttered about backups, and then smiled at nothing that had to do with logs. Norman noticed the poem fold like a secret in his pocket, as if it were a ticket for a future train. The department resumed its careful choreography of absurdity memos, hearing notices, ritual sighs, only now there was a faint warming in the margins. People walked with less of the precise, measured gait of the resigned, and more like those who had briefly been permitted to misfile their hearts. Norman filed nothing official that afternoon. He composed a marginal note in his log that did not conform to any form it had been assigned. It read, in his scratchy, earnest hand, "Preserve the small. Make room in the margins." The memo that had slid under the door remained unsent, an unshipped decree. For once, protocol had been interrupted by humanity and left to stew. Norman knew, in the same manner a man knows his address, that this afternoon had shifted something important. It did not save the world, but then, it was never promised to. It had saved something else, the possibility that people might choose one another imperfectly when the rules offered only precise ends. As the light outside leaned toward evening and the fountain's hiccup softened into a more human kind of rhythm, Norman felt the peculiar vertigo of hope. Hope is a dangerous thing for clerks because it invites new kinds of accounting. Yet he found himself willing to balance this new liability against the ledger of small human proofs he and his friends had gathered. If paperwork insisted the world could be reduced to checkboxes, then perhaps it should also be reminded that checkboxes had once been invented to remember things that mattered. A final, almost playful note arrived in the form of a departmental announcement, an intercom chirp that had the solemnity of an oracle and the timing of an unfunny joke. "Attention," the intercom intoned. "Please be advised, all employees are reminded to observe proper decorum during hours of possible existential irregularity. Baking, singing, and unauthorized kissing are not explicitly forbidden at present, but are subject to review." End bulletin. Norman laughed, a full sound this time, because the absurdity of it all made courage seem less lonely. He looked at Clara over the top of his desk, and she raised an eyebrow and a biscuit in salute. The day had forced them both to decide whether to fold their small pleasures within the administrative margins or to risk placing them where they might be seen. They had made their choice. It was messy, and it was human, and it was, in its modest way, an argument against tidy endings. Outside, the fountain hiccuped one more time, as if approving, and a pigeon performed a salute that could only be described as admirably punctual. Norman straightened his spectacles, which had slid down his nose during the kiss, and returned to his work with a lighter, decidedly less formal hand. He did not know then what would come next: audits, meetings with someone very important, or the directorate's implacable logic, but he had learned an important procedural amendment that morning: some forms are best amended by people. The department could keep its charts and its statutes. He would keep his marginalia and the memory of a lemon biscuit shared by a fountain that hiccuped in the exact, improbable rhythm of a small, human applause. And so the afternoon closed on something both perilous and promise-like: a quiet room, 2 pens left uncapped, and a world that, for all its scheduled endings, had, at least for a little while, allowed 2 people to be imperfectly present. The memo on the door remained where it had landed, and the department hummed the way a place hums after it has been reminded that work, like love, sometimes requires an unauthorized break. If the world was a ledger, Norman thought as he returned his stapler to its place, then let himself smile. Perhaps it was time to write a new marginal note. The thought felt like starting a small revolution. The fountain hiccuped as if in agreement. As the evening approached, and the final light slanted across the filing cabinets like a benevolent highlight, Norman pocketed his poem, tied his tie with more care than usual, and prepared for the next formal step, a meeting that would require more than biscuits and marginalia. He had, after all, nearly kissed someone he inexplicably liked, and for a clerk who had until now prized margins over messes, that fact was more alarming than any red ink. The afternoon had almost been love. The almost, he realized, would have to do for now, an ember kept warm in the pocket of a man learning how to make procedural allowances for human warmth. When the intercom buzzed again, Norman straightened. The department leaned toward the next stage of its choreography. A new memo had been posted, stamped in a bureaucratic font of alarm and opportunity. The next day, it promised, would be the day they officially petitioned someone very important. The world, as it so often does, had waited politely for its clerks to decide whether it should be saved by rules or by the messy, invaluable acts of people with biscuits. Norman looked at Clara. She smiled back, and they both understood that whatever came next would be done with ink-stained fingers. The final line of the poem remained folded in his pocket like a small, sturdy talisman. He takes what is torn and marks it whole. He was not sure whether that counted as heroism. He only knew it felt like duty of a kinder kind. He stepped forward toward the next day. Outside, one last hiccup sounded half fountain, half applause, and for a single, beautifully ridiculous instant, the world felt as if it were listening. Norman had always imagined that meeting someone very important would be either thunderclap theatrical lightning and harps and a voice that made wallpaper peel, or disappointingly dull a click of a pen and a 3-sentence denial. He had not imagined biscuits. The seventh atrium was not an atrium in any sensible architectural sense. It was a place where architecture had wandered off to file forms and forgotten to come back. The ceiling, when it bothered with fixtures, had chandeliers that had once belonged to committee meetings. The marble floor was stamped with institutional seals worn, as if by decades of decisive footfalls, and the plants were potted with the same solemnity as a public holiday. Ambient noise in the atrium was not so much the hum of conversation as the precise staccato of rubber stamps, bebop for administrators. They arrived as a procession of the absurd. Rita wore her bright scarf like an ensign. Aria kept her red pen visible, a talisman against chaos. Gideon carried a satchel that rustled with log files. And Tess, whose name Norman preferred not to disentangle in his head from a more private list of small courages, had been politely left at her desk with an injunction to not make a federal incident while Norman went and possibly made a global one. The janitor came too, because that was what janitors did in times of metaphysical mild crisis. They showed up and quietly remembered things. The atrium's reception desk was staffed by sphinxes. Not literal sphinxes, because literal sphinxes had been retired to a scenic archipelago after a misadventure involving riddles that had required a legal opinion. These sphinxes were of the reception variety. Beings whose smiles were smiles because that was their job, and whose eyes were carefully trained to contain an ocean of questionnaires. They greeted visitors by asking a succession of riddles, each annoying in the way only administrative riddles could be. What is the name of the form that begins with a letter and ends with a justification? How many stamps must a request have to be considered ceremonially eligible? The questions had the effect of thinning the field. People without patience for paperwork wandered away muttering. Norman answered with a practiced combination of confusion and calm. He counted stamps out loud on his fingers. He produced a union-backed petition from writer's binder like a rabbit from an inconvenient hat. He recited as though it were prayer, the clause numbers from the charter that applied to audience petitions. That was the sort of thing that passed for courage at the Department of Catastrophes, precise preparation. When the Sphinx receptionists had nodded their inscrutable nods and stamped his temporary visitors seal a curious thing that smelled faintly of coconut and regret, they handed over a lanyard and a slip that read, 7th Atrium Waiting Lane D. They took Lane D because when the department assigned lanes, it never assigned lanes for aesthetic reasons. Lane D was a corridor of waiting chairs upholstered in a practical, bureaucratic gray. And the people seated there had all the resignation that comes from years of being told the answer would be no, and having been trained to make peace with it. Norman took deep breaths in a pattern he had learned from a poem. He kept folded in his pocket a little trap for nerves, like a moth in a lamp. His folded poem smelled faintly of ink and biscuit crumbs. Gideon's part of the plan was to show their paperwork as a kind of accidental perfection. He had made an itinerary. It was, if one were being charitable about immorality, technically authentic. If one were being less charitable, one would call it a forgery. Gideon had never liked metaphor and so stuck with facts, timecodes, cross-references, security-clearing numbers. He placed them in an envelope stamped with the right protocol header and the sort of official seal that suggested a Navy would approve. Hal Brooks had, in a private moment of benevolent cruelty, whispered to Gideon that if asked what they were doing here, they should say, "We are here to ensure the continuity of municipal conveniences," and then stand still. Hal thought of continuity of municipal conveniences as a serious, defensible value and was not ashamed of it. They reached the guard at the security gate, an officer who looked as though he had been designed by an interior architect with a strict rule set and a love of high collars. He leaned over the paperwork with the casual curiosity of a bureaucrat who eats enigmas for breakfast. The guard's eyes were a bright, suspicious blue. He sniffed the air and said, "Who authorized you?" Hall produced his security badge and the exact quotation of an arcane subsection about cross-departmental courtesies. Gideon smiled the smile of someone who had proof logs that backed up his smile. Rita produced a petition with more signatures than a moderately sized referendum. Aria's presence was a sort of heavy punctuation mark. The guard's doubts dimmed because a manager's glance was the sort of thing most clerks took as evidence of gravity. The guard asked for the itinerary, Gideon presented it, and the guard read it in a manner that suggested he did not plan to be persuaded, but might be persuaded into politeness. He stamped something in triplicate, the sound echoing like permission, and waved them through. It always astonishes me how often the right stamp makes the wrong thing possible. Tom murmured to Norman as they moved through a corridor lined with portraits of people who had once saved the world and had been immediately promoted to somewhere else. "That is the only kind of astonishment I can afford," Norman said, thumb running anxiously over his tiny stapler. The atrium had then the smell of boiled biscuits and a faint undertone of old paper. Somewhere, an elevator made a noise like a tired whale. Someone very important's anteroom was tidy in a way that made tidy feel judged, a neat stack of precedent cases. A pot of tea that looked as though its water had been thinking for a very long time, and a silver plate of biscuits that were perfectly imperfect cracked across their tops, as if to suggest an appetite for realness. They were admitted. Someone very important, the name being less a proper name than a job title. The kind of thing grandparents used to place before a child's name in stories told at bedtime was not remotely what Norman had expected. He had expected a broad presence and a voice that rearranged tectonic plates. He found, instead, a person small in scale but colossal in experience, seated as though at the center of a map of decisions. The person was wearing a waistcoat that would have been considered quaint at a vintage conference, and had a teacup that might have been older than the tea's recollections. There was a cushion under their hand that gave the sense of someone who would, under no circumstances, sign anything they would later regret. "You have brought biscuit," someone very important observed after the formalities, tapping the plate as if it were an adjudicatory instrument. "I like biscuit." Biscuits make people explain things more honestly. Norman, who had never been so grateful for biscuits in all his life, felt one of his ribs loosen. Rita, who had placed a biscuit on the plate as part of a campaign she called Humanity by Snack, smiled as if she had just won a small victory. The meeting was a study in odd formalities. Someone very important made notes with a fountain pen that seemed to remember the fountain. They asked for the case number. Gideon supplied an answer of such labyrinthine precision that someone very important's eyebrows arched like small doors. Arya presented the petition with the red pen as an offering and gave a short, crisp account of departmental integrity. Hal gave a short, formal recitation of security risks, and then, in a rare flash of personal courage, read a stanza of a poem he had carried in his notebook for years. It made Arya's eyes go moist, which terrified her more than any procedural violation. When it was Norman's turn, he feared he would deliver some apposite clause, a neat appellate brief of feeling. Instead, he found he could not remember the words of law in the right order. He produced the poem from his pocket, the one he used to calm himself, and read it aloud, because the thought of talking about process felt suddenly untrue. It was a small poem. It was about a biscuit, a kettle, and a person who forgot about their umbrella and was offered one anyway. Norman read it with a voice that shook in honest places. The room listened. Someone very important ate a biscuit. Outside, a ventilation grate coughed politely, as if the building were listening too. When Norman finished, he had the peculiar sensation that he had handed over something that had not previously been permitted to be called evidence. Someone very important put down the biscuit with a deliberateness that suggested reverence. For a long moment they were very quiet. Then they spoke in a voice that did not rumble so much as rearrange the furniture of expectation. "Most things I sign," they said, "are already written in a language called law. Law is precise. Law is terrific at being fair and also boring. It like the sound of a government clock. But sometimes law is a fence, and on the other side of the fence a person drops a child. When law is a fence, people can argue about whether the child should be lent a ladder. We have to be very careful about ladders." The room leaned forward, metaphorically. "You bring me testimony," someone very important continued. "You bring me petitions. You bring me a poem about a biscuit. You make me hungry for precedent. I am hungry for precedent. It is what keeps me safe. But in this instance, I have to be convinced not by refined forms, but by a single thing that cannot be argued with under the weight of cross-examination. I will sign if, and only if, you can present me with an unarguable instance of human messy goodness." "Unarguable," Arya echoed, the red pen forgetting its place. "Unarguable," someone very important repeated. "Something messy, something with no clause. Something that would make a clerk stop to help, even if it cost them a promotion. It must not be staged, manufactured, or filed. It must be, in short, inconveniently kind, demonstrative, irrefutable." Tom's foot made a small, defeated sound. Gideon, who read logs for coffee, scanned his face for loopholes. Rita frowned in a way that meant she had already begun organizing ways to protect chance occurrences. "Meh." Enoch looked at Norman with a face that was patient as a mop. It was a curious demand. It had at once the cruelty of an impossible test and the strange mercy of a puzzle that could not be solved by protocol. Someone very important looked at each of them with eyes that had seen the department make many compromises and then grow small and lonely. "Why not accept this petition on the basis of precedent?" Arya asked, the manager's voice armored but tender. "Because precedent is a rope not tied around an old mistake, and one must not hang from a rope knowing it is both rope and knot. Because no rule should survive the unquestioning death of a person. Because precedents mount the way dead paper mounts." "I will sign," someone very important said, tapping a biscuit thoughtfully. "If you prove there is a thing people can do that does not fit into the clean architecture of rules, but nevertheless changes the world in a way the rules only pretend to measure. Bring me that demonstration. I will not sign because you ask me to sign. I will sign because your evidence convinces me that not signing is the wrong kind of prudence." Norman sat down suddenly. It felt as though the room had become smaller in order to make room for the size of the question. How he began and then stopped. How indeed. Someone very important tapped the desk and said, "It must be unarguable. It must contain the noise of human failure. It must be witnessed by someone not connected to your department, and preferably by someone who has nothing to gain by your being saved. Bring me such a thing, and I will do what is necessary. Leave me with the biscuit empty and my tea warm, and I will sign. Bring me a clean, manufactured miracle that would look good on a press release, and I will return the petition stamped with a polite refusal. The team left the room with the biscuit crumbs of hope still in their teeth. The seventh atrium felt different on the way out. The light had shifted and the Sphinx receptionists had that look that suggested they had been taking notes. On the way home, between the guards' stamped acquiescence and the atrium's chandelier hiss, they began to talk strategy, as if strategy were a thing you could assemble from a stationery kit. Rita wanted to petition neighborhoods to perform spontaneous acts of kindness. Gideon wanted to run a simulation to see how many unarguable events might plausibly arise. Tom wanted to stand in a square at noon with a sign that read "Free Kindness" and see what happened. Aria wanted to create carefully controlled improvisations with disclaimers. Norman listened, and for the first time during the entire affair, he allowed himself to imagine that messy goodness was possible, not because it was tidy, but because it was inconvenient. He thought about the little lunchtime in which his sandwich had slipped and a stamp fell, and the world tilted toward ending. He thought about Clara and the poem, and the midwife down in a village who once delivered a child in a storm by wrapping the baby in a used notice of grievance, because it was the only clean thing at hand. He thought about the janitor and his brass-handled mop, and how mops across generations had been responsible for both cleaning spills and concealing histories. "We will have to be careful not to stage this," Norman said quietly, which was the managerial equivalent of shouting in certain circles. "If someone very important suspects a production, they will call it manufactured and refuse us. It has to be messy. It has to be inconvenient. It has to be real." Rita looked at him with the fierce patience of someone who had turned small stands into broad strikes. "We won't stage it," she said. "But we can make sure the right people see it. We can clear a witness, not a department witness, a witness who is inconveniently detached. Someone with no interest in our victory and the moral courage to testify that this happened." Gideon nodded and said, "We will need logs. Not all evidence is paper. We can use cross-disciplinary corroboration. If a school teacher's improvisation saves a child, we can have medical timestamps and public transport logs to show it wasn't a production. We'll be looking for an event that leaves tracks beyond our paperwork." Tom, who could always be relied upon to find the funny and then make it useful, said, "We will be the least theatrical people who ever performed a miracle. We will stand behind a very tidy table and watch the universe trip over itself into kindness." They laughed. It was a small laugh. It was the mechanism by which people kept from strangling the clock. The meeting had given them hope and a new problem. The thing they had to procure could not be manufactured. It had to be witnessed. It had to be messy. It was the kind of request that turned careers toward improbable heroics or quiet resignations. Norman felt it in his spine. This demand would change everything. If they succeeded, the revocation might proceed. If they failed, the audit might tighten its screws, and the directorate might seal the protocol forever. Someone very important had offered them a path that required improvisation, which was a word Norman had been taught to avoid with particular emphasis because improvisation germinated error. They left the seventh atrium with a stamped slip and a lightness that felt suspiciously like peril. Outside, the world hiccuped twice. The fountain sent a small, onomatopoeic shudder into the air, and a pigeon dropped a scrap of paper onto Norman's shoe as if to remind him the cosmos was still capable of being both ridiculous and kind. "We go back to the archive tomorrow," Aria said. "We prepare lists, we arrange witnesses, we do not stage anything. We look for the mess." Norman nodded. He slid the poem back into his pocket and felt the biscuit residue like a talisman against the dread that had earlier lodged itself in his throat. There were forms to prepare, and there were things you could not fill in with ink. Between them was a kind of faith that involved not trusting the system, but trusting each other to keep a small, disorderly human light burning. As they dispersed into the department's corridors, into rooms of cheerful lethargy and quiet alarm, Norman realized his hands no longer trembled around the stapler. The stapler was smaller than the problem. He folded his hands around it the way people folded hands around moments when their ordinary courage was called. He would find a way to demonstrate messy goodness, he decided. It would be clumsy, it would be inconvenient. It would have crumbs on it. It would, he hoped, be unarguable. And in the little quiet between the files and the kettle's occasional protest, someone, somewhere, put down a biscuit and listened very carefully to the sound of people being kind in ways that could not be neatly filed. The problem was, of course, that they had no idea where to begin. They were about to find out.